This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 4. In the domains of ontology engineering and the semantic web, there are plenty of people with advanced technical skills. Practitioners with social science skills, well-developed literary instincts, and a design mindset are harder to find. Ellie Young smoothly navigates the technical and linguistic worlds that intersect in knowledge graphs, applying her humanities mindset to projects that connect scientists at NASA and address climate change and sustainability.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 4 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I am super delighted today to welcome to the show Ellie Young. Ellie is the founder of Common Action, a sustainability and climate change activist organization. She's also, the way I first met her, she's the former head of community for the Knowledge Graph Conference and one of the people who really ushered a lot of people into this community. So welcome, Ellie. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you for inviting me to be a special guest with you on this very nice community sort of visit. I've gone from KGC. I think I left about 3 years ago to starting Common Action, which is not really an activist organization. It's more like of a design and deep operations platform. And so what we're trying to do is bring technology to the climate problem, because if we think about it, I mean, there's many things that make climate challenging to solve, but one of the core sort of components is that it's a coordination challenge, it's a communication challenge, it's a really big project. And so if we think about like really big projects, right, like those tend to happen on Gmail or on Slack or maybe on Teams if you're really unlucky. And it's a lot of interaction between, moving parts, many people, and there's a lot of confusion in that, right? And it's always dependent on those people knowing each other, especially when you think about like project management software like Asana or something like that. So in the climate case, where we literally cannot know everybody who needs to do something about climate because it's the globe, how would we think about organizing those communications and supporting, specific people to like identify routes to action pathways that, help them become part of this mission set in a productive way, right? So like anybody who wants to do something about climate, where do they go? What do they do? We are trying to be that middle space, both for just sort of equipping people with strategies, and also for looking at the unfolding changes globally in the sort of physical layer, and anticipating what kind of effects we might have, and then supporting people to respond and prepare to those as well. So there's a whole lot of things that we want to facilitate, but at the end of the day, it's a technology-based firm that is bringing to the market complexity-based software, and that is always backed by knowledge graph technology.
Because how else would you ever organize that scope that you just described? That's a really ambitious domain you described. But your current work, you're working in a slightly more constrained domain. At NASA, you're working on the HelioWeb project. That's at least kind of what science is the boundary of that one.
Yeah, well, even better is like one division of science, right? So yeah, so we're just like cutting our teeth on a small project for NASA. And what this is called, and as you said, it's called HelioWeb. What this is about is basically solving some of the same communication and discovery problems for scientists who work both within NASA and beyond NASA, within like sort of this investigation space of the heliophysics, right? And so you probably haven't heard of heliophysics. It's not as well socialized as like astrophysics, but it is actually another form of astrophysics, and it's all about the study of the sun. So there's a lot of people that participate in studying the sun, not only sort of like inside NASA, as I mentioned, but also in universities and also abroad, right? Like in the European Space Agency and other related space agencies. And so, people, as I mentioned, right, like what are our collaboration opportunities? Well, we can work on Slack, we can go to Teams, and we can meet in a conference. And so what we're trying to do is expose the knowledge that is latent in a conference space, right? And we've talked about this too at KGC, so that we can see who is there beyond a simple interaction in the hallway, right? Because, let's say you go to a conference, there's 1,000 people there. You can't talk to every one of them. And even if you did, you wouldn't necessarily know everything that would be relevant for them, right? For them to tell you, for you to share with them. We just don't have like the surface area for that in our like interactions in person. So what we're doing is supplementing that with a software system that allows individuals who are part of the HelioWeb and heliophysics community to report sort of items of interest about themselves. That can be activities that they're doing, roles that they have, projects that they're organizing, softwares that they built or are maintaining, any of the contributions that they make to science, they can record it in a catalog, and then they can search using an ontology for different kinds of parameters which are not connected necessarily to an individual name, right? So like I may not know who I would like to work with in this group of thousands of scientists, because I haven't met them yet, or because, I don't know like how someone's research interests have transformed or morphed over time. But I know that I'm interested in solar flares, right? Or coronal mass eruptions. And so I can search for those topics and see what other people have contributed to the knowledge base on those topics, like, like I said, software systems or data sets or papers or whatever you have that people have entered. And then so, in that way, sort of discover the actual network. So it's this sort of user interface navigation notebook for supporting the discourse in the field alongside, making it accessible to find materials, which is also a challenge in the NASA environment. As you can imagine, they have, millions, trillions of data objects.
No kidding. As you're saying that, you're reminding me, have you ever talked to Ashley Faith about personal knowledge graphs? I
A
know
little
you.
bit.
Yeah, because as you're saying that, one of the things, because I was talking to her on another podcast years ago about the notion of personal knowledge graphs as a way to just know and understand people, and then but we were talking about them in the context of like enterprise content strategy, and it's as a way to know people who know stuff and to get permission to share stuff, like to have that sort of. But it was all about sharing the kinds of things you just mentioned, like personal interests, things you've done, activities you've done. Is that so? The way you describe that, you can totally see how you just associate in the ontology all those interests and activities with the people. Is it as simple as that, or is there more to it? Is there anything? Were there any challenges, I guess, in developing the ontology that drives that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's multiple stages of HelioWeb, and in the current moment, we're in the first stage, which is this sort of catalog. And you're right that it mirrors the idea or the many ideas behind personal knowledge graphs pretty well. And I think that I don't know if this is always like the way that personal knowledge graphs are conceived, but what's really specifically of interest to me in the HelioWeb use case, in the climate and sustainability use case, and in general in the use cases that I like to think about, there's always the interaction between the individual and the collective, the community space, right? So if I have my own instance of HelioWeb, my profile, my personal knowledge graph base that I'm adding to, that is not only for my reference, but it's also connecting into this sort of global community base, right? And yeah, I mean, so far, we've built the first foundation layer of that vision. As we continue, we hope to build, much, much more, right? So the grand vision is really for not just like a catalog and a record space, but for a discursive environment, right? So like, as I mentioned, if we want to do collaboration, and especially in science, right, we're talking to each other about the topics in the field is actually the practice of science in some ways. We are limited to email, Zoom calls, Slack, right, and these other communication technologies. And none of them have been designed for community, large-scale, intersectional, interorganizational, cross-disciplinary interaction spaces, right? Like if you think about Slack, for instance, the assumption is that you're a single workspace, typically a company. You can use it for something like a community like KGC does, but it's not designed for that, right? And so some of the features just don't really support you, including the pricing model where, it's super expensive to have a pay per seat for everyone in the open community that you might want to host. And that's just one of the many, many frictions, right? Like with NASA, there's even more frictions because you have to think about security at a really detailed level. And so like, I don't even think, some of these tools are allowed right, to be used. And so how do we pitch ourselves beyond sort of the limits of how communications technologies have been conceived of so far, right? Which is a design question. And that's the kind of thing that, that's my background is design and art and literature and sort of the humanities side of the fence where, we take a ball of string and then we look at it and we say, what could this become? Really, really differently than, what tech has been, right? Which is a lot of building on top of standards, very important to do, but also limiting in certain ways. So we're taking that sort of, in creative and curious and interactive design methodology and applying that to some of these problem sets that, really haven't been looked at in 20 years, like email, right? To get to another kind of interaction space. And so like the grand vision for HelioWeb is not only, a discovery platform, a library, but also, or even a CRM, right? Like a lookup for scientists. But it's also a space where we can allow scientists to share perspectives about the things that they're studying and seeing and reading and hearing, right? Like they're kind of talking amongst the field in this living organism of interactions that also produces a living emergent history of where the field is going, like it's sort of unfolding into the future and where it's been, right? So we can see explicit linkages between, a material that was published in, I don't know, 1970, that's foundational in the field, and that somebody may want to, reference because we learned how XYZ worked on, on the moon. And so maybe we can extrapolate something about the sun, or maybe we can extrapolate something from Mars about the sun. Like, who knows what we could really link, right? Like that's the nature of science, is a sort of lateral like interaction that is by definition novel
Yeah.
and interesting.
And as you're saying that, you're reminding me that a lot of two things about this. One, that is so awesome that like it feels like you're on the brink of like some really cool new communication tool that would, like so much of this whole community that we're in kind of originated with that notion of the semantic web. And it's never really come to the fore. I think because the use case around, I don't know, it's there, but the way you're describing this seems like something that could get as close to the semantic web as we've ever got. So there's that, the communication part of it, but also to what you were just talking about, it sort of points to the power of one of the powerful things about knowledge graph technology in particular is that inference capability, that like a bunch of stuff, how it's connected, and you can make inferences that you could never make with other technologies. So one, kudos on the cool new communications platform, but can you talk a little bit about that second point about how the technology, permits this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with communication, like part of it is just having a space, right, where you can like send the right telephone message over the line. And that really doesn't involve semantics necessarily. But with the discovery function, right, in heliophysics, especially in the science use case, especially, we do want to understand not only what the inferences are that we as ontologists say, right? So for instance, we're used to the kind of inference like, so-and-so is a human being or so-and-so is a man or a woman, thus so-and-so is a human being, right? Like the obvious sort of like state conditions that an ontologist can define. In science, we also want user-defined inferences, right? Scientists want to know what other scientists think about products. So, so-and-so claims that this data set shows that XYZ, phenomenon is caused by blah, 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 right? Or someone else presents an argument or disagrees with the argument, right? Like there's this whole discursive like interaction space, and it happens in person. It happens when you go to a conference. It happens when someone is speaking and someone raises their hand and says, I don't agree, or it happens across journal articles where the same thing happens. And there's, sort of divergent and convergent conversations, but it's not captured as metadata in those manual spaces. And thus it's not part of the search experience. It's not part of the engagement experience, right? I would like to go beyond this idea of search to this idea of like supporting workflows, which is really, you're right, what the semantic web vision initially was about. And what I've been discovering is that the methods to doing that are sort of to leverage language in ways that are informed, I guess, by like my perspective as a linguistic type of person, right? Like, what if we used standardized forms of language to express conversation styles? For instance, like a set of, 25 conversation verbs, and people could, label themselves as agreeing or disagreeing or something like that. What if that was a form of metadata entry? What if that was a form of, of not only like expressive descriptions from a person, right? Like, we're used to seeing on Facebook or Twitter with, likes, right? And whatever retweets, I guess, on Twitter. Like, what if it wasn't just us saying, yeah, I feel this way, but it was actually something that was machine readable and could start to compute, right? And say, okay, well, 55 people are arguing about this paper. Maybe it's important, right? And that elevates it on the like discovery screen. You can see, oh, this thing is getting really a lot of attention today. And that kind of interaction, that kind of symbolic communication, which is what user interfaces are all about, right? Is like, how does the computer help us to interact with it and with each other? So, I think that there's a lot of different ways to imagine how to use like the tool set that was created by Tim Berners-Lee. And I mean, the limit is always just your imagination, right? So like part of what I would like to see more of in our field is more design thinking and more creative thinking, which borrows explicitly from the arts.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm often like concerned about the lack of UX and design and humanities talent in the. Although I got to say, I'm delighted to find more and more people like you, and met a woman named Vera at a conference a couple weeks ago who's in the same of a similar mindset. But everything you were just saying about, especially about the limitation has always just been our imagination. That I feel like, and this is something we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we were getting ready for this conversation, was like, can we just make this about people instead of money? And I think a lot of the current focus and the lack of imagination is about like financial prerogatives over advancing humanity.
Yeah, especially when we think about like LLMs, right? And and how they're gonna solve everything because they're available. Like, I guess, like, oh, that makes sense to me too. Yeah, I mean, I think that like this question of what gets done and why is becoming more and more pregnant, I guess, in this space because, and like I definitely am using a very arts word there, but because we have gotten to a point of like really total efficiency. I mean, I think LLMs like describe that more than anything else, right? You can get code immediately on a subject that you know nothing about because you can ask the statistical machine to produce it, which obviously has figured out the best way, right, from all of these samples that it has. And there's a value to that. And the value certainly is like in some ways is speed, but also competition is based around ideas of variation, right? And like if we go back to the old web, which by the way is when Tim Berners-Lee was creating these languages, right? Like 2001 was still pretty early on. That was a very different experience, and there was a lot of sort of stuff that doesn't scale, right? But that is also really cool, like small blogs that people were cultivating and stuff like that. And and crazy UIs, right? Like if you go back to the Internet Archive and you look at like the 90s, you see like Nickelodeon's crazy UIs and you see like Fight Club, right? And it's so quaint now, like how they conceived of a space and so on. But the fact is that they were doing interesting things and they were doing experimental things. And And now the web almost looks like, it's one long infinity scroll and there's bars, right? And like that's what you get. You just get different colors and different shapes of boxes. And I think that users are getting bored with that. And so, as always happens, right? Like something gets to be super efficient and then it penetrates the entire market and then it's old and people move on to the next thing. So, I think that there's already like desire for, the cool stuff to come back and to be able to be found, right? And not to be like submerged in all of this noise, especially, noise that can be intensified by LLMs. But then also if we think about this in like an operational setting, right? Like our ability to solve problems is limited, and not only by imagination, because there's also real constraints, right? There's the constraints of software, there's the constraints of real life, right? But like our ability to solve problems is always defined and related to strategy. And that's what we miss, I think, a lot of the time. That's what I'm always struck by as a person who's like from the humanities entering the software space. There's not a lot of imagine what the goals are and work backwards to achieve them kind of design thought. It's really just like, this is a foundation that works. It does something similar to what we need. I've seen it before. It interacts and sort of clicks together with all these other things. Like efficiency of the build is so predominantly focused upon that the user gets left behind and the need, right? The use case itself. And so like, just to give kind of a made up example off the top of my head, a while ago, I was participating on an NSF design sprint for open knowledge networks, and open knowledge networks, just like what we're talking about now with the HelioWeb and common action projects, they're based on, sort of like lots of different types of users interacting in a shared information space for like a big picture goal. And so one of the things we talked about way back when was, nurses, right? Like nurses entering data about patients in the process of providing nursing services during their day of work. And if you think about that, like if you have something that's extremely hard to use, the nurse is not going to use it, right? Like it's just not going to be adopted as part of the workflow. But if you work backwards from that usage and context, you might be able to think of, new ways of organizing the information that don't even seem that big of a deal, right? Like, the box is here instead of there, but that totally influence her user flow and her ability to, sort of seamlessly integrate with that. So where I see there being a lot of like space for more research and more investigation and more competitiveness is in that black box of design, right? Because it just, the user is sort of forgotten in many cases, like, not even on purpose.
Your critique of the modern web is so brilliant that like you're exactly right. It is one long infinite scroll, interrupted by like, oh, look, there's a border radius of 20 instead of 10. How innovative, and that kind of. But you also mentioned around that same time the concept of variation, and this I want to try to stitch this into your interest in ecology and biology, because that the variation and adaptability are the foundation of like modern biology. Like that's how the evolution occurs and all that stuff. And I just wonder if you see like what the mechanisms might be in these systems that you're ideating and creating and actually building, to get more variability in there, to get more creativity, to inspire more of the kind of thinking that's going to be necessary to get us where you're picturing things.
Well, on a very fundamental level, right? I think there needs to be more. I'm just going to make things up because this is a pie in the sky question. Like there needs to be more ease for creating materials online. And what we're talking about, we're really talking about user experiences, I think, you and I right now. And that connects to the back end. It connects to ontologies. As I've kind of tried to, sort of allude to, I'm thinking about how metadata can be integrated in the user interface so it doesn't feel like a chore, right? And it does things that like we're not used to doing with metadata, more than labels. And what I would love to be able to do as a designer who's doing that is like play with it, like I work on paper so I can cut it up and move it around and like experimentally like view different shapes and spaces and forms. I can't do that on the web, right? I'm actually like completely incapable of doing that unless I have a developer and I describe to the developer and then the developer's like, well, I don't want to build it unless we're going to use it, and so the play space is kind of missing. And I think that, that makes it inaccessible for a lot of would-be creators who, could very easily throw up something that you and I could only like imagine imagining right now. Right? Like it's just the tooling is not there for them. And I think even we see that with like something that is more familiar to the typical knowledge graph viewer and sort of participant is like the broken spreadsheet, right? Like I've heard so many people talking about, oh my God, like we would not believe what people did to their spreadsheet. And it's like, yeah, but you know why they do that? Is because most users who are not technical, right, have so little access to creating front ends that our ability to create a front end is basically limited to like what you can jerry rig on Excel.
That is so true. Oh God, I see that everywhere in my in the things that I do. I love this idea of the missing play space and how might we create that. And I know that was sort of a pretty wide open question, but I'm just going to put that out there to the community as like, hey, let's just make this a little more playful, because we were both talking before we went on the air that we both been wrestling with like, computer stuff the last few days, just trying to get things done, and like just reduce those obstacles, please, and so we can get
Yeah.
on with fixing the web and
And
climate
and
and
that's
stuff.
that's a really, I mean, that was a common refrain that I heard while I was in community at the Knowledge Graph conference, right? It was like, how do we sell this? And it's like, okay, well, part of that is explaining to the front of house people, right? The business strategists and whoever else is making decisions, that it's necessary for them. And if they can't interact with it, right? Like if the back end that you're selling is something that's invisible to a person, it's really hard to understand what makes it better and why, like you kind of need to have something tactile. Which we know that as software people, right? It's like, don't really try to like describe your prototype, show him, like make an MVP, right? Like you have to kind of give someone something to look at. Um, but I think like, even more broadly, like to step away from UIs, because I know that that's not really what a lot of people, it's not easy to break into that, right? Like start learning Java, I guess. But like thinking about ontologies and how, a different kind of framework can inform them, right? Like as I kind of mentioned, I was thinking about literature techniques and if the world was on fire, like I would probably be writing novels, And so I think a lot about causes, like sort of plot lines, right? And like how we could do interaction space, like with heliophysics, or with climate actors as a plot, right? Like almost like a strategy that gets described in sort of a narrative form and then translate that into an ontology. And that is a very different approach from what, I've seen of ontologies, which typically start with like a bottom up kind of, here's the terminology that's being used. We don't necessarily understand it because we are computer scientists and this is just actually a bunch of strings and we're going to like, maybe add a bit of structure to make those strings make sense. But you get to a lot of these problems where like, how do we have terminology that agrees, right? How do we make these people like come to one term to describe this thing? And I would suggest that that's the wrong mindset, right? Because search, I mean, it depends on what the use case is, but in general, search should be rich and messy because we want to have many different ways to find the material, which, is probably interesting for more than one reason. And so like another example that comes from my experience with NASA, we had a vocabulary workshop in a little while ago at Goddard Space Flight Center where we were sourcing terms to put into the ontology from scientists. And we got so many terms, right? Like we were like, oh my goodness, what are the linkages between these things? And I think that that is really what we need to talk about more in the ontology world is how do we think about foundational approaches to creating linkages, especially in spaces that we are not familiar, right? Like heliophysics. I can probably make an ontology for cats and dogs. It's harder to make an ontology for MR5E, right? And other things that I like literally have no idea. But there are certainly practices that we could adopt. And I don't see a lot of sort of, material about this, right? To approach creating those linkages in a way that makes sense to the domain user, not just from, our perspective. And that's where, the mechanics of writing a novel kind of come in, right? Because these are problems that people have thought about. They're just working on different kinds of complex texts. And they're not publishing in, computer science journals, but the material is the same. It's words, and it's the way that we relate words together. So, I've noticed that there's different ways of framing the problem that allow, for some of these core problems of our domain space of the semantic web in terms of development, adoption, design, that can sort of inform those problems in a new way.
Well, I hope you're involved with Kogan and Maru on the educational stuff with the OKN, because everything you just said makes so much sense that I think you should, I personally think, and this is just, that you should be in charge of how ontology design and engineering are taught for the next 5 years. just have because your attitude in there is there's other way, but the beauty of this community is that the people who came up with the pizza ontology and the bottom up, top down and all the ontology engineering techniques.
That's Michael DeBellis. He's on our team.
Yeah. Oh, cool. So that's all well entrenched, but it feels like we're at a juncture where we could use more of your thinking. Just some. But hey, Ellie, I can't believe it. We're coming up on time already, and I could literally talk about this stuff forever with you. But before we wrap up, is there anything you want to revisit from the conversation, or just make sure that we share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think. So the information that I kind of shared about HelioWeb, we have a paper on how we designed the ontology with ethnographic methods from anthropology. And also I'm going to be writing another one that describes the broader design space. So if any of these ideas have been interesting to folks, there will be a paper forthcoming about that. And we're also developing this kind of platform for climate and for sustainability. So if people are interested in that space, especially from a volunteering for knowledge management types of projects, feel free to get in touch with me. We're interested right now in creating a phenomena ontology, right? So specifically describing things that happen in the real world and how they're related to each other, specifically in ecological contexts, and looking for NLP support for named entity recognition and things like that.
Okay, so this is the right community to be recruiting for something like that. So I'll make sure that's in the show notes. And you're making me think I need to up my game with the podcasts and these resources, and to make this enduring, so that we can share when your paper comes out. So
I have an app for that.
I know you're the exact right person. So it's very meta and circular. Well, thanks. Oh, hey, one very last thing, Ellie. If folks want to follow you or connect online, what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Ellie SELLIEYOUNG. And you can also reach out if you want to chat about anything particular to my email. I'm at ellie@common-action.org.
Great. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Thanks so much, Ellie. Great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledgegraphinsights.com, and please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.